Hello and welcome to my Black Hat session on third-party risk management, automation, and scale for security ratings. So, who am I? My name is Mike Wilkes. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at SecurityScorecard. And this headshot is admittedly a bit out of date, but I'm also not this guy either, which would be a face app, oldify version of my photo. So I'm somewhere in between. So let me tell you a little bit about my background before jumping into the discussion. I have the honor of having given Starbucks its first website back in 1998. I ran what would now be called the DevOps team, but we called it WebOps back then. That gave them their first website. My team and the company I work for, Organic Online, we also launched PlayStation.com for the Sony, for the PS2. We launched Macy's.com, Blockbuster.com, and many others. And this was, of course, the roaring 20s of my generation, I guess. The whole heady dot-com days and the rise and fall. So after surviving 5 rounds of layoffs, I actually quit and moved to Europe and started building infrastructure for ING, Rabobanks, direct banks, designing their trading floor in Utrecht. Worked on building energy management systems and infrastructure for Nuon, Vattenfall, RWE, and Ascent. And it was a great time to travel the world and to enjoy the dollar having gone down and the euro having gone up. But we moved. I moved back to the U.S. in 2013 and started working at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where we had about 10,000 servers and $2 quadrillion in contracts traded on the platform. So that was a pretty significant piece of infrastructure to be protecting. And after that, a couple of other places I worked. Most folks are quite interested in hearing stories about my time at Marvel, where I was the head of security for 2 years, and I was also the head of enterprise architecture and DevOps. So I was 3/4 of all signatures you needed to get a change through change control. And of course, I like to joke that at my time at Marvel, it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. But after Marvel, I then became the CISO at ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. ASCAP is a small 500-person, billion-dollar organization that pays royalties to people that write songs. You can't find a more warm and fuzzy mission than putting, food on the table for the people that are stitching together the literal fabric of our society with their crafts work and their creations. So I'm a musician myself. I play drums, I play jazz mostly, and ASCAP, like I said, the board of directors, the chairman of the board is Paul Williams, who wrote The Rainbow Connection for the Muppet movie. So you can't find a more warm and fuzzy value-based mission or organization to work for. So I love my time at ASCAP. But now I'm, like I said, working at SecurityScorecard. I used the platform previously in both of those prior positions, and I'm really excited now to be seeing how the sausage is made, helping improve the product and grow and scale its solution, and helping to make the world a safer place with our ratings platform. So my session today, I want to go through a discussion of first, second, and third-party risk, and then briefly talk about discovery of risk, and then move into a couple of slides on continuous monitoring. But the main thing I wanted to present in this session is this idea of event-based assessments, where we don't have this leisurely sending out a questionnaire every 12 months to our top vendors saying, have you been breached in the last 12 months? And of course, having someone reply, yes, we were breached 11 months ago. That's the last moment you want to learn about it. And so the coupling of our ratings platform with the Atlas security questionnaires allows us for a very powerful combination that I wanted to explain and share. All right, so first, second, and third-party risk. First party is framed around self-attestation, right? It is you, and you have complete internal awareness of your infrastructure. Your management of that and trust is created through control, direct control. And then, of course, your enterprise risk management program is the framework for understanding that risk. In the case of second-party risk, where you're working and talking with your customers, it's a customer attestation. They're the ones that say whether or not they like your services. And those customers have a first-hand awareness of some of the infrastructure, but it's partial, right? They're only interfacing with some of it, whether it's available, whether it throws an error, things like that. The trust framework is through familiarity and loyalty with your brand and with your reputation as a vendor. And the risk management is obtained through a contractual relationship, terms and conditions of the contract. Third-party risk which has been a bit of a poster child this last year because of things like SolarWinds, Orion being compromised by the Russians and putting a backdoor into their monitoring software. Everyone kind of knows and is paying attention to supply chain risk and third-party risk nowadays. Now, one of the benefits of third parties is that they have an external attestation process, and that they have this incomplete awareness because they don't know what's happening on the infrastructure on the inside if they're doing assessments. But the trust is delivered through impartiality. And so when we do a pen test, for example, of our infrastructure, we seek a third party to do it so that they can come at it without any bias. And so trust is achieved through impartiality there. And of course, the vendor risk is through a VRM program, a vendor risk management. And of course, your third parties also have vendors. And so this is where we talk about fourth party or just the extrapolation to nth party risk. And in this case, you're talking about peer attestation. You have minimal awareness of what's really happening under the hood with some of these vendors that are supporting your vendors. And so you're basically exerting or exercising trust by proxy. And lastly, I wanted to talk about this ecosystem of risk management. So it's not just your first, degree upstream providers and partners and your first degree downstream, subscribers. We have to talk more about the entire ecosystem, and I'll get into that in just a few slides. One of the things, of course, is taking these 4 dimensions of risk. I wanted to talk a little bit about attestation. So if Colonial Pipeline had performed a self-assessment in 2020, what really would have changed, when they were hacked by DarkSide? Probably nothing after that assessment, right? They wouldn't have changed. They would have just said, yes, these are our security controls and we think they're adequate. So what we really need are tools that can validate the assertions of a compliance. And that's one of the beauties of the ratings platform coupled with the assessments for Atlas, is that we're scanning the internet, all of IPv4, every day. And some segments we're scanning multiple times a day. And we're actually able to confirm or deny some of those attestations that come from assessments. And so if someone says that they're patching all of their servers within 30 days of vulnerabilities coming out, then why are we seeing a 2017 CVE on their Apache on one of their IP addresses? And so it's important to have a validation tool that can help make sure that attestations can be challenged or confirmed. On the dimension of awareness, who could actually afford to scan and monitor all of your vendor APIs, websites, certificates, and services? It would be cost prohibitive if you were to do that with a license for Tenable or for Qualys or Rapid7 or one of these other vulnerability management solutions. So we're doing that for you. We're scanning all of IPv4 every day. And to be able to do that and to surface all those vulnerabilities and to make them instantly available to you in our platform is a very powerful tool. And again, coupling that with event-based assessments and knowing that when there's a score drop or there's a breach event, that you can actually automatically send a questionnaire that's tailored for that vendor with zero touch from your team. So you don't have to scale your team linearly to handle thousands of vendors that are being monitored continuously. And then on the third dimension here, trust. If zero trust architecture means never trust, always verify, then for what values of always are practical? Does it mean that we simply insert 3-factor or 4-factor authentication on every authentication event that occurs? No, I don't think that that's the solution. That's a bit of an inflationary approach. We can't just simply keep adding factors of auth in order to implement the spirit of zero trust architectures. So we need something a little more powerful than that. And then the last dimension, management of the supply chain risk, right? When that 20,000 container, the Ever Given, lodged itself sideways in the Suez Canal in March for 6 days, how many markets were affected? A lot of them. How many people started hoarding different supplies again, just like we experienced with the COVID and the lockdown? We couldn't get toilet paper and laptops. The supply chain was disrupted radically last year. And so now we all know it's true and serious. We're not dealing with a tabletop exercise, which might have been the only situation where someone might have discussed, a global pandemic. Everyone's working from home. But here we are, living and emerging on the other side of it. So basically, we need to pay attention to not just our first-degree neighbors in the upstream and downstream relationships of goods and services, but we need to think about the entire ecosystem. So again, third and nth party risk across the supply chain. So how do we mitigate that last quartile of risk? Because a lot of us security officers and professionals working in this area, we're pretty good at getting to the first, second, and third quartile. We figure out how much it costs to mitigate various risks, and we don't really get rid of all risk, but we do take it to a residual level that the business is willing to accept. And the real challenge, though, is how do you mitigate that last quartile, the fourth quartile of risk? And it's got lots of interesting aspects to it, right? Identification of the risk is oftentimes dealing with unexpected or unthinkable scenarios, like the Russians hacking into SolarWinds Orion build server and pushing a backdoor out to everyone, and then compromising all of those companies. There's also forgotten infrastructure, things that have been created by a marketing team, that swiped a credit card, bought an AWS account, hosted a WordPress site on it many years ago, and has since left it untended, and now it's putting out malware, right? Because it's been breached, and it's still part of your DNS, so it's still part of your reputation, right? It's still part of your attack surface. The other aspect, of course, is that a lot of these edge cases are emerging in the fourth quartile, and if risk is equal to likelihood times impact, these are essentially the unlikely events, but they have potentially big impact. And again, we saw a lot of that happen recently with some of the breaches and compromises of the last year. And of course, there's an aspect of decreasing ROI, right? Decreasing return on investment for trying to close out that last quartile of risk. So we're purchasing tools, we're creating processes, we're hiring people, but really it's an asymptote, right, that you're approaching. And you could spend millions of dollars trying to get to that last bit of risk mitigation. But I think there's other ways to tackle the problem, and I want to share them with you. So, and lastly, of course, problems of scale. Some kinds of problems and failures only emerge at scale, and they often only emerge in production environments. And so it's important to understand that automation and the integration of assessments and event-based assessments is a powerful combination to help address some of these aspects of the fourth quartile of risk. All right, so for discovery. Oftentimes when we're talking with a customer or with a prospect, there's a little bit of a bias towards knowing what their infrastructure is, the inside-out perspective, right? I call this the declarative infrastructure. Vulnerability management tools are typically set to scan the inside assets, but only some of the first-party external assets. So there's some risk there that's not being identified. Why? Because it's expensive to monitor all of your vendors if you have 100 of them or 1,000 of them or even 20,000 of them, which we'll talk about in a minute. So mitigating controls of some of the declarative assets, yes, you can actually downgrade the risk of something by having a WAF or having intrusion protection or having some type of other tools and technology like endpoint, next generation endpoint tools that'll quarantine and mitigate based on behavioral aspects of a machine being breached. But of course, when we talked about pen tests, that often begins with a request to the network team saying, well, which IP addresses are we going to be pen testing? And this is where I like to bring in the de facto infrastructure. So the fact that we're scanning all of the internet every day means that we're finding things that you didn't know about from a declarative point of view. And these are assets that are de facto yours that we can show through attribution of a subject alternate name on a certificate or ownership of a net block or other types of identifiers in the code and in the response of a web page. So we're scanning all of your first, second, third, and nth party external assets, the whole of IPv4, which is cost prohibitive, like I said, to do it with vulnerability management tools. And of course, there's this aspect of rogue or black ops or forgotten assets, and this presents an attack vector with significant risks. So, discovery of risk, solving problems at scale, just a couple of numbers to throw out. 30 to 40 billion security findings are discovered and mapped each week by our ratings engine. We have over 700 million malware events observed each day by our sinkholes. And our fast score process allows you to create a score and a scorecard for any entity within 10 minutes of just simply typing the domain name into our platform. So we're at 10 million rated companies at this point, and we will be at 20 million, I'm sure, by the end of the year. And it's that level of scale that is unequaled by any of the other vendors that are working in security ratings. They have maybe 300,000, 500,000 vendors that they've scored, and they're just not operating at the same level of scale. We're orders of magnitude faster and orders of magnitude larger in our data set. Shown here real quick is a visualization of the dark web from HyperionGray.com. This is based on about 6,000 websites running on Tor's onion services. And this is actually an interactive image, so if you drill down, you'll actually see the web page for each one of those websites on the dark web. And so there's lots of bad actors out there, a lot of risk, a lot of people buying and selling credentials, and buying and selling a $10 Slack token to break into electronic arts. So how do you discover your risk? How do you mitigate that and do it at scale? So let's talk about continuous monitoring. That's one of the ways that you can keep abreast of all of these risks and changes. I like to mention the Greek philosopher and historian Heraclitus. He said something along the lines of, you can never step into the same river twice. So this is not AI or machine learning hype. This is basically OG InfoSec. The river analogy works very well for InfoSec. Some folks want to sit, on an inner tube with a six-pack of beer and float lazily along on the oxbow of a winding river, and that's their journey. Others want to strap on a helmet and head straight for the Class 5 rapids to get to the next stretch of their digital journey. But continuous monitoring has to be a part of everyone's future. In this case, I'm talking about our security ratings platform doing continuous monitoring of over 10 million companies, scanning every IP4 address every day. And some of those network segments, like for cloud service providers, which is about 60 to 70 million IPs, we scan those 12 times a day in order to have the best and most accurate attribution possible. All right, so let's get into the meat of it, event-based assessments. So when you're looking at a vendor and you're renewing or thinking of renewing a contract with them, you go through a couple of reviews and you do some vendor disposition discussions. And of course, if we're talking about event-based assessments, the real interesting stuff is if you can tie sending assessments to a breach event, a score drop, or a particular CVE or issue or finding that shows up, like an exposed Microsoft RDP server, for example. So in the review phase, you have legal terms and conditions. You might be looking at a 1-year review of their security posture on a 3-year contract. You may be looking to see whether the company that you have as a vendor has been acquired or is about to acquire another company. That can change your risk posture. And of course, data scope changes. Has the data classification of information that's shared with the vendor changed? That would potentially increase the risk if they're sharing more sensitive data. Also, I'd like to point out the vendor disposition. Some vendors are in a cannot fail category, right, due to nepotism, golf course conversations, things like that. There's also vendors that have already failed and they're doomed and they're not going to be renewed. It could be due to a breach of contract. It could be due to other reasons that contribute to you just offboarding that vendor. And then, of course, there are those vendors that have an increased or decreased risk, and you need to understand that as you head into the assessment. And then lastly, those breach events. So let's talk about event-based assessments. So event-based assessments enables immediate reassessment of that vendor. You don't have to wait 12 months for a periodic review. And this scales to thousands of companies. We've got 20,000 vendors portfolio, some of our customers. Score drop events, breach events, tailored assessments that are being sent to them based on the Tier 1 vendors versus Tier 2. And then, of course, you can maintain a small VRM team because you're using this automation and scale with event-based assessments. What happens when there's an event, right? Well, it's going to be a shields up moment, right? What was the rule that was triggered? What was the vendor? Do you want to disable their access? Do you want to disable their integration? And of course, which assessments do you want to send? And then lastly, what are the conditions for standing down from the event? So what we've learned with our Atlas platform is that some of the most popular frameworks, and we have about 30 of them that are in the platform, are the SIGs, SIG-Lite, SIG-Full, and SIG-Core, NIST, ISO, and the CMMC. About 7 days to complete, 2 days for the sender to close it out, and about 3 to 4 rounds back and forth between you and your vendors. And then what's the most common standards or custom frameworks? We're seeing a lot of custom questionnaires used by customers. So here's an example of a shared assessment from the SIG core, and this is what it looks like on Atlas. So if you're sending this out, you can set up a portfolio rule that sends this whenever one of those events is triggered, like I said, a score drop or a breach. And the SIG Lite is around 330 questions. The SIG core shown here is about 1,000 questions targeting 18 individual risk controls, and the SIG full is around 1,600 questions. And the beauty of this, of course, is that it's all in one place. You're not emailing around spreadsheets, and the answers that you get and receive from different vendors are all tracked with the assets with an evidence repository or artifact locker. And in this case, I'm just showing you what it looks like to begin one of these questionnaires. You have discussion about the point, you have attachments, and again, it's not in 1,000 different formats. This is the same format for all of the different, or 30 different frameworks that we use. This next picture shows the real magic that I was talking about. A breach event is reported. So you're writing a rule in the ratings platform, and you're going to send out a questionnaire and potentially a Slack webhook when the breach event happens. And so this is a simple but powerful way to take the two products that we have, the two platforms, Atlas questionnaires and the security ratings, to confirm or deny different types of assessments and answers that have been given on those questionnaires. This next example is for a CVE that would be detected in a specific portfolio that sends a questionnaire and a Slack webhook. In this screenshot, I'm using a portfolio that contains the Department of Energy's 17 national laboratories, which includes Sandia, Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge, etc. So in summary, you have your first, second, third-party risk, and it's becoming clear that systemic risk is an emergent property of complex systems. If we all pay attention to the health and resilience of the ecosystem, the supply chain itself will also be addressed. There's only one network, discovery of risk, right? The internet is everyone's network. There is no inside, there is no outside. And if you take this and believe this to be true, then security is not really an execution problem, it's a design problem. We need to make sure we design our systems to be resilient and fault tolerant, and to have transparency and visibility into the supply chain risk. Of course, continuous monitoring is a critical aspect to scaling and automating this. So no news, of course, is good news in this front, right? If you have everything monitored and you're monitoring everything every day, I like to say that when security professionals do our jobs well, then the technology is not discussed. Just like the fish don't talk about the water. And of course, event-based assessments, the key part of this delivery. Automate what you can and delegate the rest. There's no dignity in suffering the toils of repetitive tasks and error-prone habits. Seek effortless scale so that you can focus on the interesting work. And then lastly, I'd like to do an executive plug for the Principles of Board Governance of Cyber Risk, published by the World Economic Forum this March. I worked on the working group to publish these revised principles of guidance, and I wanted to make sure that you had them in the link for the slides, and you can make sure that your board of directors also understands that cybersecurity is a strategic business enabler. Economic drivers have to be understood as an impact on cyber risk, and aligning cyber risk management, of course, with the business needs. Otherwise, you're speaking crazy moon language about CVEs and vulnerabilities, and the rest of the board of directors don't really know what you're talking about. And number 4, ensure organizational design supports cybersecurity and good communications. And principle number 5, incorporate cybersecurity expertise into your board governance. And lastly, principle number 6, encourage systemic resilience and collaboration. So thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Black Hat.